Hello, everyone. This is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for continued support. A quick technical thing before we get started. I'm trying a new attachment for my mic to help with the audio quality. This should hopefully help with the really bad popping we've been seeing in a lot of my recent videos, where every time I say the letter P, for instance in Pathfinder, it's creating a really painful popping sound, especially for headphone users. So if you notice better or worse audio quality, please leave a comment letting me know, just so that I know what direction to go in for future videos. Is it too quiet? Is it too loud? Has the popping not been fixed at all? Etc. In today's video, I wanted to talk about utility magic in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, there is this common perspective I have seen online that Pathfinder 2nd Edition's magical utility is significantly weaker and significantly less permissive than what you would expect from other Dungeons & Dragons games, like 5th edition D&D, 3.5e D&D, and even Pathfinder 1st edition. And obviously that is true to some extent. I'm not going to pretend that utility magic is identically powerful in PF2E as it is in other systems. But I do think this tendency gets a little overblown, and I have noticed a contradiction in my experience with utility magic in D&D 5e versus how it is presented as being different than Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and I want to get into that and talk a little bit about why I think Pathfinder 2nd Edition spells have a lot more practical utility than you might think, even if their theoretical utility might appear lower. Before getting into all that, though, I want to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Crystal Maggie. Crystal Maggie is a shop where you can purchase a lot of different accessories for your TTRPGs. They recently sent me a dice box with the picture of a phoenix on it, which you can see here, and it is gorgeous and well crafted. And they also sent me a dice set with dragon skulls inside it that I'll put a picture of on the screen because I'm not able to show it through my webcam. It's kind of blurry when I do that, and it looks fantastic. Now, if any of y'all are watching this channel, you're probably a math nerd, and a math nerd's first question when they think about a die with a dragon skull inside it like that is this die properly weighted? Can I expect a reasonable set of rolls, or am I going to get a lot of 1s or a lot of 20s, depending on how the dragon skull is positioned? And that's a valid question. That was the first question that came to my mind too. So I did the obvious thing. I rolled a die 500 times, the d20 specifically, just to see, are the results as I expected? And honestly, I was a little surprised by this too. It's a pretty well-weighted die. The mean average roll was 10.608. And as we all know, the mean of a d20 should be 10.5. And that's really close for a sample size of 500. And the standard deviation was plus or minus 5.7. And the theoretical standard deviation of a uniform distribution is 5.77. So again, very close to how you would expect a uniform distribution's variance to line up. And finally, in a sample of 500 rolls, a perfectly weighted die would have 25 1s, 25 2s, 25 3s, so on and so forth, all the way up to 25 20s. So I also cataloged that, and as you can see, it was very close to being that as well. Obviously, there is some up and down variance, but the red and the blue lines, again, show the theoretical, where you would expect 25 of them exactly each, and the actual average of this data set, which is 25 points something or the other. So the dice came out pretty evenly weighted. I don't see any major ups and downs. I know technically the modal roll was a 6, but I don't think it was so much by a significant enough margin to suggest that the die might be weighted. So I was surprised by this, and I feel like that sort of speaks to the quality of the dice themselves. And if you want some gorgeous dice, which now you know are not weighted because they're well made, make sure to check out the link in the video description below and use the code Mathfinder at checkout for a little discount. Now back to the video. Now let's have a chat about utility spells. And this is going to be less of a Pathfinder optimization focused video like most of my content, and more so just game design musings about Pathfinder, and also to a lesser extent D&D 5th edition, and even a little bit of D&D 4th edition. This video was inspired while I was watching a recent video series from Treant Monk. Treant Monk, if you don't know, is a D&D 5e/5.5e YouTuber who releases optimization content for those games, and recently he's been releasing his flagship wizard build series, where he talks about how he would build sort of the canonical wizard in D&D 5.5e, and setting aside all of the optimization, because that's an entirely different game that a lot of my audience does not necessarily want to optimize for, the specific thing that stood out to me was a lot of the times he would pick ritual spells for his spellbook with the following justification. First, he would talk about how it is a great utility spell to have, because a lot of the utility spells in 5th edition D&D are really powerful. But despite how powerful they are, the sorcerer and bard in the party, if being optimized, are simply not going to pick it. It is too expensive for them to do it. And a cleric or druid might prepare it because they can swap their spells day to day, but they will never do so just in case. They will only do so at the beginning of a day that they know it's going to matter. The wizard is the only one who's going to get to pick every single ritual spell and just keep it in their spellbook right up until it's needed. And those familiar with D&D might know this exact conversation he's talking about, and those unfamiliar, that's fine, but watching this video sort of made me think back to my own experiences when I regularly played D&D 5e and 5.5e, and it all sort of holds true. I never really consciously perceived this, but I would rarely see utility spells being used by non-wizard characters. Wizards would use them all the time, whereas non-wizard characters, I'd say like 95% of the time, were not using such spells. Like even things like Detect Magic, Identify, Water Breathing, I wouldn't see them come from non-wizard characters unless the player knew it was really relevant to the campaign already. Conversely, in Pathfinder 2nd edition, I see utility spells all the time. I see every variety of utility spells. I see things like Carry All, Unseen Servant, Water Breathing, Water Walking. I have seen utility spells from rank 1 all the way up to rank 9 get used regularly by every variety of caster, and plenty of non-casters who just try to figure out ways to get access to that utility magic that casters can use. And I do want to get the obvious out of the way. This is subject to table variation. You might have played at a table where you see utility spells all the time in D&D 5e. And conversely, you might not have seen that much utility used in Pathfinder 2nd edition. I get that. That table variation could come from any number of different places. That being said, I think it's still true to generally say that in D&D 5th edition, wizards use utility spells way more than any other caster, whereas in Pathfinder 2nd edition, all casters are going to use them roughly equally often. Whether that be a lot or a little depends on the variation that you see at your tables. And yet, isn't it commonly accepted that Pathfinder utility is weaker than D&D? And in many ways it is. So where does that difference come from? Why is it that utility is so much weaker in Pathfinder, and yet it gets used so much of the time, so often? And investigating that is what led me down this video idea and this line of thought. And an important note, when I say utility in this video, in context of this video, I just mean non-combat utility. I'm not talking about how some people would consider anti-flying tools in combat to be utility, or they might consider force movement to be utility in combat. I know the word utility is broad and can mean a lot of different things, but in the context of this video and this design musing, I am only talking about things you want to do outside of combat that don't affect combats. They're there for other things. So let's start by analyzing the strength of D&D's utility magic and contrasting it with Pathfinder's. This will help set up a baseline for our later answering of the question of why Pathfinder utility spells see so much more play. A very important note here, though, I am excluding any spell that is a glitch in terms of what it does for utility. I am only analyzing real utility spells that a real living, breathing human GM is ever going to allow you to do. This means no infinite money glitches, no using something like shape change to loop into infinite wish like D&D 5.5e allows you to do, no creating infinitely large armies with true polymorph like D&D 5e allows you to do. None of those infinite utilities. And this is a high bar for glitch. I am not saying we should ignore every single potentially overpowered, potentially setting warping utility spell. Like, I'm not saying we should ignore Goodberry in D&D. Keep it, because it does what it's intended to do, even if that intent has some setting implications. I'm simply excluding anything that is very obviously a glitch by being able to go infinite in a way that developers did not foresee. And to be clear, I am not just penalizing D&D utility here. Pathfinder has its own equivalents of things like this. Any character by level 4 can use Timber Sentinel to make an infinitely large forest, for example. Any spellcaster at level 19, if they get access to the Dominate spell, can recruit an army of level 19 and 20 characters who are arguably more setting warping than that true polymorph glitch I mentioned earlier that D&D 5e has. So both games have their own glitchy utility, and for both games we will just be ignoring it, removing it from the conversation, and narrowing down to things you will actually get to do in your campaigns. Now, in general, people say that D&D 5 and 5.5e utility spells are stronger than Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and we can analyze this among many different dimensions. First up, there are many options that, even if they are available in Pathfinder, they become available much earlier in D&D. For example, Goodberry. Right away at level 1, Druids and Rangers can feed 10 people per spell slot for a whole day. Pathfinder's equivalent of that, the Cornucopia focus spell, is not that powerful. It needs to heighten before it can feed that many people over the course of a day. Likewise, the Sending spell is a 3rd rank spell in D&D, whereas it's 4th rank in Pathfinder. There are many such examples in both games, where despite the fact that the Pathfinder spell has equal utility, it just comes online later. Then there are types of spells where they're often less conditional or more reliable. For example, Message in Pathfinder requires line of effect. The exact same spell in D&D does not require line of effect unless it is blocked by something like lead. Knock in Pathfinder can be counteracted with sufficiently powerful locks. In D&D, it just always works on every single lock. Detect Magic in D&D gives you way more information than what Pathfinder's Detect Magic does, although there are different ranks now, like Detect Magic is a cantrip, and in D&D it's a 1st level spell, but still. Then there's the fact that sometimes D&D spells tend to be much more multimodal. They're allowed to accomplish a whole lot of more things. For example, in D&D 5.5e, we have the Elementalism cantrip, and in D&D 5e, we have its predecessors, like Shape Water, Move Earth, etc. And all of these are generally able to accomplish a lot more than what you would accomplish with a cantrip in Pathfinder, and oftentimes don't even have equivalents. Same for something like Druidcraft. It can achieve like 4 or 5 different things. Same for Prestidigitation. The cantrips in 5e tend to be more multimodal, and the same is also true for some higher rank spells. Then there are also spells that just take considerably less time to do in D&D than they do in Pathfinder. For example, Find Familiar can be cast in about an hour and 10 minutes in D&D, whereas in Pathfinder, most familiars take a week to come back if they're dropped. Then there's the Legend Lore spell, whose Pathfinder equivalent is the Collective Memories Ritual, and the ritual takes way more time than a Legend Lore spell does. Now, I know over here I am deviating into things that are not really spells in Pathfinder, but I will talk more about that later on. For now, let's just assume we're doing a fair comparison. And finally, there are cases where utility spells in D&D just do plain old more potent things. Guidance in D&D is just way more powerful than it is in Pathfinder. And this is true irrespective of the level you're at. Tiny Hut in D&D is way stronger than its equivalent spell in Pathfinder, and again, it's true irrespective of whatever level you're at. So honestly, from every single angle possible, D&D 5e's utility spells appear stronger. Even if you analyze both in context of their own respective games, it's still really fair to say D&D's utility spells are stronger. And to be clear, Pathfinder's utility spells are not bad. See the video linked above? They're still very good and very worth using. But why would D&D's utility spells see less use than Pathfinder's spells? I would understand if Pathfinder's good utility spells saw some use, and then D&D's better utility spells saw more use. Why is there this pattern that other D&D YouTubers have pointed to, that utility spells won't get picked much except by wizards? Well, the sole reason for that, as mentioned in the previous slide, is opportunity cost. It is, for some reason, more expensive for non-wizard characters to do utility spells in D&D. We will analyze why that's the case in D&D, and why that's not the case in Pathfinder, and that sort of tells us why Pathfinder's utility spells are so much more usable. For the first argument, we will be comparing spell progression and spell slot progression for D&D and Pathfinder casters. And obviously, some of you might immediately notice that I'm ignoring ritual casting. I will get to that later. But first, we must set up this argument while ignoring ritual casting and pretending that you must always cast utility spells from your spell slots so that we can analyze the design space that rituals take up later and then figure out what Pathfinder's equivalent is. But while assuming that you must use spell slots on utility, what does it look like for the two spellcasters? Well, let's take a level 11 caster as a reference point. Why am I choosing level 11? Because when you're in the much lower level range, let's say 1 to 5-ish, you're not really going to be considering spending too many of your slots on utility. You might spend 1 or 2, and this is true for both games, but most of your slots are going to be defining your combat role, and they must be doing so because otherwise you're just going to be very lackluster in combat. Once you're of a high enough level to have a significant amount of low rank slots, that is when this comparison really starts mattering. And then I put this comparison at level 11 just so I can illustrate the point a little better. These are what the spellcasting tables for the two games look like for a full caster. In D&D 5e, you will have 4 first rank slots, 3 each of 2nd, 3rd, and 4th rank slots, 2 5th rank slots, and 1 singular 6th rank slot. In Pathfinder, you're going to have 4 of every single rank other than 6th, of which you'll have 3 slots available. And next level, you will even have 4 of those slots. The end result is that the Pathfinder spellcaster simply has way more spell slots to work with. And this just means that Pathfinder casters are going to have a lot more room for utility spells if you're casting them from your slots. This is also true of 3-slot casters, by the way. It might seem like I'm cherry-picking by using a 4-slot caster in Pathfinder, but not considering 3-slot casters, but it still works out. Because typically speaking, 3-slot casters have at least one feature that justifies them having fewer slots. Druids have focus spells so good that they feel like they're basically max rank slots, as I talked about in my Druid video linked above. Clerics have their font feature. Witches also have a lot more longevity for combat usage between their familiar ability, fantastic focus spells, and their built-in focus cantrips. And the Bard also gets focus cantrips and has very good uses of charisma and or weapons depending on the subclass you go with. So 3-slot casters will still benefit from this. In fact, I would go so far as to say that 3-slot casters in Pathfinder have longevity comparable to a Warlock in D&D 5e, where just like the Warlock can always rely on Eldritch Blast, a 3-slot caster will always have things to rely on that are not their spell slots, and then they will use spell slots to put explosiveness and reliability on top of their shtick. But that also means that just like the 4-slot casters in Pathfinder, they will have spell slots left to spare for utility. And if you take the comparison further up in levels, all the way up to level 20, this is only going to get more and more true as you level up. At level 11, you had what? 6 more spell slots than a D&D caster? By level 20, you have way more slots available, nearly double, because a D&D spellcaster, their spell slots fall off in number as you level up. You don't get 4 6th rank slots, you get 2, 2, 1, 1 of 6, 7, 8, and 9th ranks at their maximum. Meanwhile, a Pathfinder caster always receives 4 of their slots once they level past it, except their 10th rank slot. That is the only slot that sees any form of decay. So by level 20, the gap has gotten even larger because the Pathfinder spellcaster keeps receiving more and more spell slots in a linear fashion. It never decays. And in both games, I am currently ignoring class features, but I don't think they change the equation that much. In D&D, the wizard's arcane recovery means they have more slots than their table indicates. That's fair, but that's also true for a Pathfinder wizard, because the Pathfinder wizard has Drain Bonded Item. They have their Thesis, which can give them pseudo spell slots or actual spell slots in the case of spell blending. They can have a familiar that gives them additional spell slots. They can have feats like Re-Prepare Spells, Scroll Adept, Spell Mastery, Archwizard's Might, all of which can give them more spell slots. So when it comes down to it, I think this table comparison is pretty representative, and in fact, I think if we start incorporating features and feats, the Pathfinder caster will get even more spell slots comparatively by the time you're in higher level play. And I really do want to emphasize, the spell slot comparison holds up on every layer when you look at it from every angle. I already talked about class features, but it's not just that. Whatever length of adventuring day you consider, the Pathfinder character will still have more slots to spare. Even if you make the assumption that a D&D slot generally gives you more bang for their buck, which is fair because of concentration, the Pathfinder character still has so many more slots that it's not going to end up mattering. Sure, one can make the argument that a 6th rank concentration spell in D&D is worth a lot more than a Pathfinder 6th rank spell. I don't think you're going to be able to convince me it's worth 3 times as much, though. And don't forget, lower rank slots also need to get used in combat to some degree in both games. In D&D, you might be using those lower rank slots on Shield, Absorb Elements, or Tasha's Mind Whip. In Pathfinder, you might be using them on Hidebound and Wooden Double and Acid Grip. And the Pathfinder caster will also have more of those, which means once you consider that those lower rank slots are being strained as well, there's an even bigger gap in what the Pathfinder character gets to spare for utility. No matter how you look at it, the comparison is going to hold up. And if you're at a low attrition table, you might not notice a difference. If you're at one of those tables where you have 1 encounter days and otherwise are just kind of chilling and long resting after or doing a lot of roleplay before and after, you're not going to notice that much of a difference. In both games, you'll be using plenty of utility spells on all casters. But if you have even a little bit of attrition, you will immediately start to notice a difference because your spell slots will get strained faster in D&D than they would in Pathfinder. I also want to note here a sidebar for optimized play specifically. In D&D, if you're optimizing, there's going to be plenty of your slots that become pre-buffs. Things like Aid, Find Steed, Hero's Feast, etc. So depending on what caster you are, you may not have certain spells. Like a cleric, for example, I'm not going to say they have 3 second rank spells because they're probably spending them on Aid repeatedly throughout the day. A druid is almost certainly not going to have their 6th rank slot available. It is going to be used on Hero's Feast at an optimized table. This is not going to apply to every table, but this is something worth noting. The more optimized your table is, the more strained your spell slots will be in those specific ways. And these are powerful, don't doubt that at all. These are good uses of those spell slots, but a powerful combat use that you end up spending your spell slot on means you have even less utility to spare. That is just what it means for the sake of this argument. The end result is that D&D characters will typically have fewer spell slots to spare and fewer spells known available for the sake of utility. So if you're ignoring rituals, if you're assuming that you must know a spell and then cast it from your spell slot to be able to use utility, Pathfinder casters have a significantly lower opportunity cost in that dimension and are just able to use utility spells more. But now we gotta address the Find Familiar shaped elephant in the room. I have just been assuming that D&D characters are expending a spell slot on their utility, but most of the time they don't have to do that for some minor short-term utility. Ritual spells exist and they gotta be addressed. If I don't address them, I'm not making a complete and fair argument. Now, in my opinion, people make a mistake when comparing D&D's rituals to Pathfinder's utility magic, and that is to compare it to Pathfinder's rituals. Pathfinder has a thing called rituals, and since that's the exact same name, you'll very easily make the mistake of just comparing that with D&D's rituals. But Pathfinder's rituals don't really cover all of the same design space that D&D's rituals do. What design space do D&D's rituals cover? There are 2 distinct spaces they're going for. The first is spending a cost of some kind, usually just time, but sometimes gold too, for a beneficial short duration effect of some kind. This includes things like Find Familiar, Detect Magic, Unseen Servant, Identify, Water Breathing, Tiny Hut, and countless more rituals. The commonality between all of these rituals is that you're doing something that benefits you personally and potentially your adventuring party. Find Familiar gives you a scout or an item valet. Detect Magic helps you and your party find magic. Unseen Servant is kinda like having always-on telekinesis. Identify helps you identify magic items. Water Breathing helps you and your party breathe underwater. Tiny Hut gives you all a safe space to rest. All of these are effects that are really not trying to have an impact on the whole world, just on the safety, the convenience of your party. And then there are rituals that create longer duration, potentially world-changing impact with narrative implications. This includes things like Gias or Skywrite or Contact Other Plane. You're making a deal with someone, a bargain with someone, or you're sending a message to your allies in a different city, or you're contacting your warlock's patron, or any number of things like this. These are the rituals that have narrative implications. And obviously between the two, from a party optimization perspective, the first is the one that's more important. More important might be a leading way of phrasing it, but it's certainly the more common one. You're much more likely to find familiar in a D&D game than you are to Skywrite. That is just true, because find familiar is something every adventuring party can make good use of, whereas Skywrite will depend on the campaign structure your GM has thrown at you. And Pathfinder's rituals do very little of that first design space, and mostly they just do the second design space. I can think of single-digit amount of rituals that do that first bit of design space. What? There's Guardian's Ages, Harrow, Lucky Month, maybe Butterfly Bender, but honestly, I would consider that narratively important as well, not really just personally important. And the summoning ritual spells are actually specifically designed to only be narratively important and not have good mechanical impact. So Pathfinder's rituals are really just not trying to fill that first design space. A few of them randomly do, but for the most part, Pathfinder's rituals are just trying to do things like Gias or Skywrite or Contact Other Plane or Clone or Create Demiplane. All of these things that you should just be discussing with your GM to try and world build collaboratively with. It's not meant to be something that you just pick as a player-facing option in a vacuum and then just do something with, you know? So what about that first design space? What is there in Pathfinder that is equivalent to this design space in D&D? What is it that has some kind of a meaningful cost, potentially a mix of time and or gold, allows spellcasters to gain a short dose of utility to help their party with, often on a daily time duration, and does so without expending spell slots? It is, of course, scrolls and wands, and any savvy Pathfinder player will tell you as much. Unlike D&D, you are expected to have access to these items. They're common items. Any common spell, you can simply go and buy a scroll of, provided you have a shopping session at a settlement of an appropriate level. Just like a savvy D&D player can trivialize certain challenges with clever ritual selection, you can do the same with scroll selection. In fact, Pathfinder has many spells that just overlap with what you can do in D&D 5e. You have Phantasmal Minion that overlaps with Unseen Servant. Carry-All is just Tenser's Floating Disc, but a little bit better, actually. Water Breathing is Water Breathing. Telepathic Bond is the same as Rory's Telepathic Bond. And obviously there are exceptions, but for the most part, things that you would ritual cast in D&D to gain a short dose of utility, in Pathfinder you would simply cast them out of a scroll. And from what I understand, this is actually very comparable to the design of rituals in D&D 4th edition. In D&D 4th edition, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong since I haven't played the game, rituals were just scrolls you bought and read off of. And there would be a skill check and a minor gold cost associated with getting the short duration utility. So that's another data point showcasing how, like, there's a spectrum of what this design space can be, and in D&D 5e, this just looks like doing your own rituals. And in Pathfinder, this just looks like using a scroll that you bought at a shop, and in D&D 4e, they like merged those two subsystems in a meaningful way. So now that you have a full picture of the two games, now that you're not vaguely just trying to compare utility versus utility, nor are you trying to incorrectly compare rituals versus rituals, because Pathfinder's rituals fill a different design space. Now that you know that, there are two cases to consider. The first is that when you are actually using a spell slot for your utility, for example, using the knock spell to open a door, Pathfinder casters typically just have many more spell slots and are just much more likely to be able to do so. And when you are using a ritual in D&D 5e to do some utility, like if you're using Unseen Servant or Water Breathing, in Pathfinder, a lot of the time you can get a similar amount of low opportunity cost by just buying scrolls or wands of the utility you want. You buy scrolls of the utility you expect to have once in an adventure, you buy wands of the utility you expect to want once in a day. So I might have a wand of Carry-All because I might want to carry heavy stuff around all day, but I might have a scroll of Water Breathing because I'm not diving underwater that often. I might have a wand of Telepathic Bond because telepathy with your friends is always nice, And I might have a scroll of Gecko Grip because I don't expect to need to climb things in a time constraint every single day. And finally, let's tie it all up by talking about the thing that prompted this video. What is it about the D&D wizard that makes it special in terms of using utility magic? Why is it the one exception that uses a ton of utility spells and every other caster in D&D 5e just seems to be using it a lot less? Well, in D&D 5.5e, every single spellcaster is allowed to learn ritual spells. This was not true in 5e. Many did not have access to rituals at all, and they were obviously the least utilitarian casters in the game. Now, every single caster can do ritual spells, but it is still a very, very high opportunity cost to do so for most spellcasters. Every other spellcaster in D&D has to expend a spell prepared to have that utility spell available. For someone like the Bard or Sorcerer, this is actually a really hefty cost because they change their spell preparations every time they level up. They can't retrain out of them otherwise. So once you have something like water breathing on your spells prepared, it's not going away until the next level. Druids and clerics have less of this cost. They can change their spells prepared every single day, and to a lesser extent, so can rangers and paladins. But there's still a daily opportunity cost to do so, so you're mostly only going to do it if you know it's going to matter. You're never going to do it just in case. The wizard is the one and only exception. They are allowed to have a whole brace of rituals for the very low cost of having it in your spellbook without preparing it every single day. In fact, you can spend half or more of your spells learned as you keep leveling up on rituals and still have both of the following two things: as many prepared spells as any other caster. Even a sorcerer with a full list of subclass spells will have only about as many spells as you do prepared, and you will have more rituals than those casters have prepared spells. So all in all, you will have like 40 spells when everyone else is like 15, because you're using your actual prepared spells, the ones you cast with spell slots, and you have unlimited access to every single ritual in your spellbook, which is effectively like having more spell preparations. And that is why the wizard was singled out at the start of this video. They are, in fact, the one and only D&D 5e caster who will consistently be using utility spells throughout a campaign. Other casters are most of the time going to have to pay a very hefty opportunity cost for doing so, and thus, in a lot of high combat games, you're actually just not going to see casters using utility spells in D&D 5e. But what about Pathfinder? Does the Pathfinder wizard have something similar? Well, yes, it kind of does, actually. It's the spell substitution thesis, and it's not exactly the same because you're not just using all these utility spells with no cost, but you are still the wizard that gets to specialize in having access to utility that is otherwise too high of an opportunity cost for other wizards. Remember, every caster, including the spell substitution wizard, is going to have access to itemization. You will still have scrolls of water breathing. You will still have wands of telepathic bond. But when you come across a day when your scroll of water breathing was not that useful, you're still able to switch out a spell prepared and find a utility spell that was in your spellbook that's more applicable to the situation. And that does make the spell sub wizard uniquely better at dealing with utility out of their spellbook than any other caster in Pathfinder. And that sort of serves the same niche. Nowhere near to the same extent that the D&D wizard does. The D&D wizard is the king of utility. They can basically solve every problem with a nearly invisible opportunity cost, but there is a thematic equivalent of that, and I figured we might as well mention it to close the loop on this argument. So what's the verdict? Now that we have explored some of the opportunity cost of spells in both games and talked a little bit about the design behind both, what's the overall point? Why am I saying that I have seen Pathfinder utility get used much more often than D&D utility? I think utility options in Pathfinder are almost too underrated, and I think there's like a heavy negativity bias towards them. My play experience with them has hugely differed from online perception. Online discourse for Pathfinder utility spells almost exclusively focuses on how weak they are compared to what you would find in D&D 5e, D&D 5.5e, or even Pathfinder 1st edition, and yet that just doesn't seem to matter at the actual table. So what gives? I think following through on all of the arguments I've set up so far, I come to this conclusion. If you compare spell to spell between the two games, D&D 5e and 5.5e has the obviously stronger utility options. There is no denying it. At the beginning, when I talked about the advantages utility spells in this game have, they're just above and beyond in every single dimension. This gives them a very high theoretical utility. When you look at Goodberry in D&D, you're like, oh my god, my druid can settle down and just solve the hunger for like a town or something by just giving them good berries every single day? Yeah, your druid can do that. Is that going to happen at a real table? Maybe after a campaign, and that's fun to think about, but does that utility matter at the table? Meanwhile, when you compare caster to caster, you're going to unlock practical utility. You're going to find out that Pathfinder 2E's casters have a lot more utility they're going to bring to the table. This is because the opportunity cost is lower in every single dimension. If you think about utility spells that you cast from your spell slots, Pathfinder casters just have more of those spell slots to use utility with. If you think about utility spells D&D casters would use rituals on, Pathfinder casters can usually stock spell scrolls and wands, and their only opportunity cost then is the gold cost of having those in their pocket. There's no further opportunity cost. You don't actually lose any combat prowess by having a scroll on you that does water breathing, whereas in D&D, any spellcaster other than the wizard, by choosing to have water breathing, by choosing to have find familiar, by choosing to have unseen servant, by choosing to have detect magic, any ritual, every single one of those is making them slightly worse at combat because they have one less spell they could use in combat, one less spell prepared. And because of that, you will notice that if you have a character that identifies all this utility, Pathfinder casters generally use much more utility than D&D ones. Online discourse has really painted Pathfinder utility with this kind of a risk averseness. If a spell is not as powerful as it was in Pathfinder 1st Edition, or as D&D 5e set you up to expect, is it even worth casting? And likewise, if combat is balanced, shouldn't I keep all my spells for combat and not worry about non-combat at all, since my non-combat utility spells are so weak anyways? I promise you, it is worth it. Carry a few scrolls of utility spells. Have a few utility spells in your spell repertoire, spell preparation, especially once you get into higher level play and you're not using all of your low rank spells for combat. I promise you it'll be worth it. I can confirm this from play experience. In fact, I would go so far as to say that not picking utility might be leaving quite a bit of power on the table. When my wizard got into high level play, I would keep a whole brace of utility spells in my wands and scrolls. I had a wand of Anthal. I had a wand with a 4th rank Carryall. I had a wand of water breathing, because why not just spend a little bit of gold on making sure your party can just breathe underwater every single day, just in case it's gonna matter one day. These are very low opportunity costs once you get to high level. And in fact, I got to a point where I started running out of gold, so I just started using my actual factual spell slots on this, because again, when I am a level 17 wizard and I have what, like 50 spell slots after considering class features, items, staff, etc., there's really no need to worry about them. I started daily spending a 5th and 6th rank spell slot on See the Unseen and Elemental Sense so that I can scout through walls, see invisible enemies, etc. I started casting Telepathic Bond out of my 5th rank slots. Because of the way spell slot progression works, you are going to reach a point in Pathfinder where so many of your lower rank spell slots are going unused that you might as well have utility in them, and if you don't, you are just leaving power on the table. And likewise, if you're not spending your gold on utility and you're kind of just buying random items you don't care about, you're also leaving a lot of useful power on the table, not to mention a lot of fun on the table. It is fun to just solve challenges, right? So the end result is this. Pathfinder casters simply have a ton of utility available to them. If you're at one of the tables like mine, where people have been using utility spells all the time and you're not sure how it's seeing so much more play despite the utility being weaker than other games, now you know why that's the case. It's because of the theoretical versus practical divide, where individual spells might have very high theoretical utility, but the game needs to enable you to actually cast them. If you're playing on one of the tables where you don't use utility spells because you're so risk averse about them, give it a try. It will make a difference. It'll make everyone's game a little bit more fun. It'll make you have more fun with your caster, and you won't find yourself having suboptimal performance, especially if you're like past level 7 or so and most of your spell slots are going to waste. Stock those scrolls and wands of useful spells. Even use your spell slots on useful spells. It is worth it, I promise. That'll be all for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you liked listening to me ramble about the design of these two games with like very little of a direction. If you like the style of video, please comment and let me know, and likewise if you don't like it and you prefer my regularly scheduled content. Regardless, please like, comment, and subscribe. They're all great ways of supporting the channel, and click the notifications bell if you want to know when I post my next video. If you'd like to directly support me, please consider joining a channel membership or purchasing some accessories for your next game from Crystal Maggie, linked in the video description below. If you use the code Mathfinder at checkout, you will get a discount and I will get a portion of the commission. My next video is going to be going back to the Marshall series that I teased in my previous video, linked above, and I hope to see you all there. Mathfinder out.